welcome back, everyone. So we are Tuesday, October 21st, and I think this is the 8th session of our 12th Soil Nutrition Conference, reNaturing Ourselves. Really honored to have Diane Ian Haggerty on with us today. They're complete legends from Australia. They've just been doing amazing work on so many levels, and yeah, I don't even know where to begin as far as sharing an introduction. They were recently honored as People of the Year for Western Australia. Their work on the land, in community, with nature, food systems, education. They're just real amazing people. So we're very grateful that they're up at 1 o'clock in the morning for them. They've been having a very full a few months with all their accolades and great work. So very grateful for them getting up in the middle of the night to speak to us. So I'll let you guys take it from there. You guys just about ready? As usual, I'll just say one last thing. Please feel free to engage with each other in the chat and post your questions in the Q&A box. And thank you, Shauna, for such a wonderful job standing in for me last week as well with Abe. All right, Diane Ian, you ready to take it away?
All good. Good morning, or good evening to everybody else, whatever it might be.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for having us, Dan.
You're very welcome.
Morning, Dan.
Hey, good to see you, Ian.
A little bit technologically challenged this morning, especially at this time of the morning, to get the brain to actually do anything. But yeah, you might need to lead us along a little bit, Dan, to make sure we got it right.
Okay.
But anyway,
I think if you can turn that screen share back on again.
Yep.
You guys should be able to take it away. I would presume to turn my camera off and let you run for a while, and then when you feel like you're done, we'll engage the questions.
Okay. Does that look okay?
It is coming through. Yep, there we are. Beautiful. All right.
So I guess now just use these other buttons to make it work, maybe.
Yep, the down button usually works, or the right hand.
What's it doing there? Why won't it move?
I just use the keyboard.
I've been trying to do that, Dan. Oh yeah, there we go.
There we are. All right.
Yes, we do express our gratitude to the elders past and present for the land that we're farming over here in Balladong country. Beautiful part of the wheat belt, which is pretty well clearly indicated there on Western Australia. Fairly large parcel of land, which was originally delineated by the government to be cleared of a lot of the native vegetation, which was cleared some hundreds of years ago now. But yes, that's roughly where we are, mostly at Mullerin now, as opposed to the Wildcatcham area. But unfortunately, I guess, as a result of a lot of that over-clearing, there's a lot of biodiversity loss throughout Western Australia, the wheatbelt area. And as that's progressed, there's been a lot of salinisation. And I've just found out in the last week or two that the rate of increased salinisation is about 14,000 hectares a year. So it's taking out what would be 3 average sized farms a year being lost to increasing salinisation. So there's a few issues going on there. And this is what it looks like from the satellite. A lot of the rainfall patterns too have changed a fair bit as a result of that. So you can see the rain clouds there following through where the uncleared country is, and the rabbit-proof fence, which is an iconic structure, man-made structure, obviously, just showing the difference in the rainfall patterns going around those areas. But just a little bit about us ourselves personally. We purchased our own farm, 1,660 hectares in 1994, which was considered completely unviable. But we had the, I guess the ideas of young keen youth that you could do it, and we got started with conventional farming alongside my father next door because we needed to borrow some machinery in return for man hours on tractors on his farming property to get some things happening. So I guess that was probably a fairly, difficult start, but it was, we had all the vim and vigour of a young family. We had 2 young boys at the time, and off we went. It was about 2001 where we had I guess what we'd call a bit of an eye-opener. We went to a 4-day workshop with Dr. Arden Anderson and Dr. Elaine Ingham. They both sort of gave us a bit of a rundown on how soil microbes can be very useful as a workforce and can do a heck of a lot for enhancing the productivity of your whole farming operation. And Arden in particular then gave us the understanding that also that what you do with your soil is very directly linked to the health of the food that you're actually ultimately producing. And I guess as farmers, that's what our prime role is, to be a food producer. And so we, really took that message to heart. I have a background as an occupational therapist in health, so the idea of preventative health really fitted closely with us. And at the same time, we met a lovely lady by the name of Jane Slattery, who helped us with understanding how animals can be involved in the evolution of landscapes, and how to get in touch, I guess, with the innate abilities of those animals, and also to then get in touch with the innate abilities that we had as humans as well. So ultimately, we ended up kicking for different goals of what would have been from a conventional farming system, which was all focused on yield, to be looking at how we can create a more self-sustaining operation, which had a really different focus on what was the best outcome. And looking at trying to restore our landscapes again. So the picture you see there of the grasses, that is a native grass in Western Australia, which isn't commonly seen, certainly not at that density. This is on the Molleran farm, which we took over in between 2014 and 2016, and some of the outcomes with a bit of summer rain, some pretty amazing return of native species. And then the livestock, of course, which are our key tool, I guess, for being able to, transform a landscape. Want to say anything at any stage?
No, I think you're doing an excellent job, quite frankly.
I'd rather the husband was speaking a bit more, but anyway, so the livestock effectively have been what have taught us a lot. We started off by taking away some of the traditional farming practices, I guess, that would be considered how to run livestock, with internal parasite control. We stopped doing the drenching early on in the piece in 2001. We ceased mulesing. We have a complete merino flock, and it was typical practice that you would mule them in trying to handle fly strike issues, but we found that by breeding them and having the animal's whole system nicely balanced with a natural diet, because we stopped doing anything like artificial supplements with grain and so forth, so kept their rumen health more natural, stopped interfering basically with whatever was going on with their rumen, and then increased, where possible, the biodiversity from a natural plant perspective in their diet, and also enabling the animals to access that biodiversity all the time as much as possible. So instead of moving them around a lot under our direction, we've always made sure that there's bits of native bushland or salt bushland or the native diverse pastures, and if there's not, there'll be a multi-species sown pasture for the animals there to be able to choose what they want when they want, to manage their own health, and they've shown that they're absolute masters of that. But not only maintaining their own health, they're also very astute in how to restore parts of the large landscape we operate over. What parts need more attention. They use their own sense of smell to be able to find those areas that need their attention, with, toileting more, and bringing plants and microbial populations from wider afield to different parts of the paddocks. And to do that, to accumulate and utilise that wisdom, they need to be a self-replacing flock so that the mothers can teach their lambs once they're born, but also, most importantly, whilst in utero too, the lamb is programmed to have a capacity when it's born to interact well with the environment that it's part of. And just a clear example there of how the fungi are quite happy to have an association with the manure. And a conventional farm where animals are typically being drenched frequently or fed grain and having an acidic pH within their gut, often the manure just doesn't get consumed by the microbes very rapidly at all. And if so, it's typically bacteria that might have a taste of it. But when you've got fungi being the dominant decomposer, it's a bit more interesting. So some of the things that we've noticed also with the livestock as a result of allowing them to access their own wisdom and utilise it, that they're very, I guess you'd call it, feed and water efficient. The lambs grow rapidly, grow healthily. The ewes maintain good weight throughout their whole production, because we've got focus on meat and wool for the livestock. It's very easy to track quality through the wool side of the animal. Their micron has reduced over time with, improved staple length and strength on their wool and an incredible softness. So it's highly sought after in the fibre industry because of the fact that it is such an incredibly soft but lustrous fibre.
Well, I think if you look at the faces on those animals there in the photo, I think everyone can probably see them, how clean their faces are. So in a broad landscape like here, it's red country, a lot of red country, and getting the sheep get a really shabby look about them. You can see they got nice, white, bright, clean faces. Around their eyes are nice and clean. Around their nostrils is clean. So it's a really good sign of health for animals that are coming out of large landscapes. And these animals, might only come into the yards, a couple of times a year. So that's a good indication.
And I think that's a really key point that Ian's mentioned there is, given that they use their sense of smell a lot in making their judgments for what their body needs, but also what their landscape needs, they've got to have a good clear nose, because quite often what Ian was describing there is that these areas are typically, dusty because they're dry. They could be dry for 8 months of the year. It's not uncommon, unfortunately, but they've got to have a very nice, clear nasal passage so that they can sense what they need all the time. Just an example of some of the wool quality that I was talking about.
Once you get the animal balanced and right and in tune with its environment, in a natural system, the outcomes of, a lot of people probably really understand is absolutely mind-blowing. It's when all that starts to link together, and especially with sheep, you can get them through a few generations like that. That's where the 1 + 1 = 3 starts to add up. The wool quality has absolutely blown us away over the years. You get that amino acid portfolio formation of the follicle of the wool, and it's a completely different fibre. It handles completely different. 100% comfort factor straight off the animal, no matter what the season is, whether we have a 84 mil growing season year, or we have a 250 mil growing season year. It's the consistency is spot on and the same regardless. The fleece is always bright and white, so it doesn't get no colour or dust or anything into it, and it's always soft. It's always got a high newtons per kilotex, so a high strength to it, so it won't break when it's getting in the knitting machines. And it's just a consistent, fantastic product to deal with. So hence that's why it's highly sought by the fashion industry.
it, and it also transfers directly into the meat with the flavour also, and also I guess their growth rates, which I mentioned before. But the growth rates also is the feed efficiency. The animals spend most of their day sleeping because now they've got a point where the nutritional, I guess, profile of the plants that they've got available to graze to them meets their needs very rapidly. We've got a bit of a saying here that one mouthful in this area is equivalent to 10 mouthfuls or more in some of the higher rainfall zones. So your capacity to run the livestock well over the season is enhanced. And we also have had some really interesting understanding over the last few summers. We've been noticing that the animals, well, for some years now, that the animals don't have a huge need to drink. And in the past summer, we had weeks of 40 degrees Celsius plus through December and January. And during some of that time, we actually had a mob of ewes actually on a transportable water truck because we were using a part of the farm that didn't have, good water supply to be able to use the whole paddock well, because some of the paddocks out here are up to 500 hectares big. So if you've got a water point at one end, you don't want them walking all the way there all the time. So we put a water truck up at another part of the paddock, and the animals were only going to water, a very bare minimum. So we made sure that they were getting there, knew where it was, everything else. And we were able to track that their water consumption was actually only about a third of what it would typically be in those conditions, and particularly on a completely dry diet at the time. So there was no capacity of the landscape itself to be providing much water via the vegetation. What it was would have been minuscule, but I was speaking to an esteemed scientist in Australia, Walter Jenner, and he was describing, because he's known our livestock for many years, and describing their capacity to make metabolic water in the gut, so reducing their actual requirements. So it was a pretty phenomenal thing. It's something we had been observing for a number of years, but to be able to track it specifically by using measured water was pretty phenomenal.
I think you find also then when you look at that meat side of it there, it's it's a great product. It's you can see there's some marbling right the way through it, being straight past animals, but also these meats seem to have a very low melting point of the fats. So it's when you cook that stuff, it has you don't need really high temperatures, and it's it just performs tremendously.
So I guess I've probably detoured a little bit going down the animal line fairly strongly, but basically we started working on the whole soil microbiome, I guess, within the cropping system as well. And perhaps to be a little bit clear, we've got currently about 24,000 hectares that we're looking after, and half of that a year would go into crop, and the other half would the animals would run over as a pasture. And then during the summer season, so we only have one crop a year during the winter time, and then over the summer the animals would graze the stubbles of the crop as well. So we do have the animal impact on each part of the farm each year, but there's certainly a 50-50 roughly ratio between cropping and pasture land. And it was at the same time where we were working with the cropping, taking out the fungicides and insecticides back in 2001 and synthetic fertilisers, so that we could focus on looking after that soil microbiome. So whilst the animals were doing such an excellent job, we had to make sure that we were doing our part of the heavy lifting in the cropping side at the same time. So as I said, we mentioned dropping out the artificial fertilisers. So what did we do to replace that? We started using some worm liquids, and some compost extracts was probably been a key driver for us. We actually have two really large scale compost extractors on the property, capable of making between the two of them about 36,000 litres of extract an hour. Would that be right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So that's that, and of course then with the microbiome out of the sheep rumen being moved around the landscape. They're probably 3 key points of opportunity to have that natural fertility coming along. And for those that love machinery, that's some of the gear we've had used a few years ago. These slides are getting a little bit old, with the disc seeder out the back, and then we use the boom spray for putting out the liquid compost extract and a mix of fish, seaweed, humic and fulvic acids as a food stuff when we put out the compost extracts. Just a bit of an indicator of the liquid system for the seeding program.
So we use a liquid inject system at seeding time. So when, well, first of all, the seeds are coated with extracts and worm liquids. So they're coated before going into the air cart, and you're running a disc seeder there. Out the back, we have a liquid carpet we run, and we direct inject into the furrow using a friction flow liquid system at fairly low pressure. So we're injecting about 50 litres on average to the hectare of our compost extract liquid brew at seeding time when the crops are getting sown. Now that can be when it's completely dry too, so it's not unusual for us to start seeding for us over here in March, late March, and we'll seed right the way through until probably the end of the first week in June. And so that this year we started seeding right at the end of March, in the last week of March, and we didn't actually see any rain until the end of the second week in June. So we sowed the whole, I think we sowed about 13,000 hectares this year, some of it multi-species cover crops, and that was all sown 100% dry, considering we hadn't had any rain since the previous November. So we'll still liquid inject, and then later on, as Di said, the crops start, when it gets up to about the 4-leaf stage, we start applying, we do a pass of liquid foliars with the boom sprays.
Okay, so I guess that's where the plants have, helped out immensely, as you'd imagine, with trying to, replenish some of the soils that we've got here. It's typical throughout parts of the wheat belt to be going onto a new property with organic matters around the 0.3 sort of level on an average. They're very ancient soils here, not like some of the new soils that might be in other parts of Europe and America. There's, particularly on Western Australia, there's very little volcanic activity from the past. So very weathered and very old, sandy type soils, not a lot of structure that are there places. But when I've been speaking to Walter Yenner about it, what has occurred though over that long period of time and the millions of years that these soils have been formed is the evolution of the biological diversity within the soil to cope with these leached and low nutrient soils. So there has been the evolution of an incredibly intricate biological diversity within the soils in its native state, and an incredible diversity of the plants and fauna that have been in this area. So Western Australia, particularly this wheat belt area, is one of the biological hotspots and biodiverse hotspots globally, and a lot of it's due to that long-term evolution of the microbes.
So just looking at that picture there, the picture on your left, so one of the typical soils out here, which has been, a lot of these soils have been very run down through, over tillage, overgrazing, and a lot of this country, we've taken on has been pretty bare and just blowing away. So you look at that subsoil there, that's I don't know what you're seeing on your thing, but generally that's a yellowy looking type soil. Generally that stuff there, we call it wodgel soils, has a pH of probably, that stuff there would have had a pH of 3.5 to probably 4.5 at the best. And so you can see just by year.
That's only a 2-3
2-3 period, but we can't see there because we done that pit out with a lower is fine right down in subsoil there, and they were going down to like over 1.5 meters or 2 meters to that's only how far we dug. But if you followed them down, they were going down. And when you did a pH test on those fine root systems going down, you know, they were neutral pH in that fine system in the rhizophyta of where those roots were going down. So that's how those root systems can force their way into such an acidic system, build topsoil, and also break up the hard pans. So if you look on the picture on your, so that was the picture on your left, look on the picture on your right. Sorry, it is 1 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, so you see there where those plants have hit a hard tillage. That's only a second year crop, I think, on that one. They've hit the hard tillage pan, and you can see where they've branched out a little bit, but then actually roots have to push and break through. What you can see there is the picture of the bigger one, the bigger root system. That's actually a small wheat plant and the size of its root system. The one, and that's in the furrow with the compost extracts. The other smaller root system is actually a radish plant. So that's on the interrow. So a radish is classed in a cropping system as a weed over here, but grazing system is good feed. But you can see the difference that stimulation is made in the furrow. So rather than trying to, when you're going into new country, treat the whole surface to start off with, we're actually really concentrating it in the furrow where the wheat plant is grown. And that then is giving that an advantage to get up and actually produce, to actually give that in that stage to give us a cash crop. So that's how you can actually start to set up the score sheet. So your cash crop can be actually one step in front of the other plants that are in the system, and so you can build your biology and actually get a cash return at the same time.
And just to reinforce that point, a lot of the properties that we've taken on probably in the last 2 decades have had resistant radish populations to a lot of different herbicides and so forth. And we've just found that over time, just by doing exactly that, the plants are able to, you know, the crop plants are able to outcompete the radish, and the radish does become, you know, lesser, smaller, less vigorous. So yeah, where you take on a property and the radish would go 6 feet tall, it's getting down to about the 2 feet tall and a lot less dense.
My background in previous years was through family farming, was industrial agriculture, and you always had there's a policy there of take no prisoners. So it was either wheat or nothing at all, where in this natural intelligence farming system, it's really about setting up a bit of a competition sheet, a score sheet. So actually you can actually have the species that you want to go through and make it into a cash crop slightly in front of the others. So you have the diversity of everything else there, but you still able to actually harvest that cash crop, and which is what we all really need to do, because I don't know about the rest around the world, but Australia, when you're buying land, you generally pay fairly high interest rates, and you've got commitments to meet.
So one of the other exciting parts, I guess, of working with the microbes has been its capacity, not only through those root structures that we were looking at before, around those rhizosheaths, having the capacity there to bring the carbon into the whole soil equation, restoring that soil structure and so forth, but has been the benefit of the creation of the nitrogen story, even without necessarily using legumes. And when we first started changing our farming practice and unfolding with natural intelligence, that we weren't actually using a lot of legumes within our phase. This was pre our understanding of the need for multi-species cover crops and all that kind of thing. And to make the bills pay, we were having to, do a bit of wheat on wheat, because that was the most profitable. We didn't want to go down the canola line because we've always thought that that's probably a bit too harsh on the soil. We weren't happy with how that plant, interacted a lot with the microbes, particularly mycorrhizal fungi. Wasn't a supporter of mycorrhizal fungi, so we weren't using canola either. So we were using some continuous cereal at times to get ourselves up and going, and we're still able to get really good nitrogen assimilation into the plants, even without using any synthetic nitrogen fertilizers at all. And we had some deep soil testing done in 2012, which is a fair while ago now, but that not only recognised the capacity of a strong microbial system to increase carbon sequestration, but also we had a higher nitrogen store within the soil, even without, might have been 8 or 10 years of not using any synthetic fertilisers at that point, or necessarily any legumes in the cropping phase. We still had way higher nitrogen capacity within the soil over that time frame, utilising the microbial populations. Just some of the key scientists that have been wonderful to come and share their knowledge with us on property. A lot of people would know Dr. Christine Jones, an incredible woman and wonderful Australian scientist, Walter Yenner, who I've already mentioned, and Nicole Masters, who's over at Montana these days. We don't get to see as much of her now that she's on that side of the world, but we've had some wonderful times with Nicole. So, of course, if you know Dr. Christine Jones, it's all been about the liquid carbon pathway, and she was the one that opened our eyes to that, of course. We've been seeing these things in the paddock. We had seen that the tractors weren't working as hard as the soil tilth improved and so forth, and it was Christine who gave us that understanding that that's what we'd been facilitating for a period of time, was the ability of those plants with their microbial associations to get more carbon in the soils and, of course, soften the soils and start rebuilding that soil structure and that soil sponge that Walter Yenner talks about a lot. Given that these plant roots were doing all the heavy lifting, and we have a little bit of an obsession with of that whole nutrient side of things, helping us to understand, as I mentioned, the livestock and what they've been able to do with restoring the microbiome within their gut using their own wisdom. Walter says really we should be selling our animals purely as microbial factories, because he says they're so good in what they're able to access throughout this environment and this landscape, and what they can retain within their gut, the diversity there, not only affecting their own health but the landscape, and contributing to our cropping program has been amazing. Very fortunate to have a fellow in Western Australia by the name of Phil Lee, who's got an incredible microscope. This is an older picture that he took for us, indicating the mycorrhizal fungi around this is a wheat plant root in the very early stages of its growth, and it was actually a dry soil. But if you look at that soil there, it actually looks a bit moist around the rhizosheath. And yeah, it's been wonderful to see these things from Phil's skilled abilities. And that one there on the right-hand corner just shows the difference between when there's been a synthetic fertiliser use. So the rhizosheath capacity is minimised, the ability of the plants to facilitate soil structure rebuild with the microbes is virtually wiped out. So you can see that clearly, if you haven't got those microbial associations within your root systems, your ability to restore a soil and rebuild its capacity to function is wiped out, and that's where you do get the soil degradation over a period of time. And once again, these were very dry soils, and these were the two pictures there you see, with one with the worm liquid compost extract on the seed, and the other one where there's a soil structure being rebuilt and a fungal strand across the picture, across the open lens of the soil. That was in the nodule soil that Ian was talking about, so the high acidic, high aluminium content soils. Yeah, certainly wouldn't be very conducive to much, but once you get that fungal system operating again within a diverse microbial section of the soil, it makes a big difference. Those familiar with the work of Walter Yen know he's very much into the soil sponge and that water cycle. We looked at earlier on just the change in the large landscape water patterns with the rainfall clouds. Going around the wheat belt a fair bit, unless there's a fair bit of cyclonic activity coming from the north, that can be difficult unless you're, within the first 100, 150 kilometres from the coast. It peters off fairly rapidly from there. But once we've seen the changes, Ian was talking about, we put the extracts down the tube at seeding time and work on that furrow. And that has been a key point, because what we've noticed, even the first year on a new property, once we've put a crop onto that system with the worm juice or the compost extract down the tube with the crop, and the crop's done its job for the growing season, if we have summer rain, the native grasses and plants will actually come up in the line that the crop had been into. And so we're able to get more summer green activity. So there is a longer growing season of winter plants as well. But then if there's summer rain, we get a lot of the native growth. So the key factor there is trying to get some green plants year round, and that's what's been made possible.
So realistically, that there by those native plants actually forming in the furrow, when starting off a system, when you look at 50 litres to the hectare and that's spread over a full hectare, it's actually not a lot in the things. But when you concentrate that 50 litres down to a 1-inch band in the furrow over the hectare, you're getting actually a fair concentration. So it gets to be a little bit of a numbers game, and that's what really then, especially when you're going into dry soils, actually start your quorum sensing and start to get that going. So it's a really good way to start to actually, and then to get things going and enhance it in a really quick way. You'll also find by having the worm liquids in with our compost extracts and that, worm liquids naturally have like a little bit of an oily film on them. So by actually doing that, we actually, when you looked at the end product and actually it goes down into the soil, and it can be a fairly hot day, 40 degrees Celsius, and you can actually see the droplets that actually can roll up into an actual ball and be covered by soil, because it actually has that oily film on it and actually holds surface tension over the droplets. So in that dry and heat, you can actually hold that all together and keep its integrity of actually that droplet and liquid until the nighttime atmosphere comes in. So by actually having the furrow effect and the composition of the product with that slight oily film because of the worm liquids makes a big difference in harsh conditions, because we've got to really understand that you just don't always get the perfect conditions. And when you get to scale, you can't get everything done in the perfect conditions because you don't get enough time period to do that. So you have to be able to have something that's versatile and go out in all conditions.
Just on the picture on the far right too, the matter there laying on top of the soil there is actually a native summer active plant as well called mulla mulla, and we print that down and direct seeded the crop into that. Just saying, we have mentioned a little bit about some of the summer grasses coming back, but also some of the salt bushes and so forth that we can crop into. So virtually looking at what Coal Sice has created with the pasture cropping, trying to retain as many of those native plants as possible within the cropping zone. And then in parts having to revegetate as well, because we did talk about at the very beginning a lot of the government mandated policy if you had to clear certain amounts of, a large proportion of each land mass to have your parcel of land. So putting back some of the biodiverse vegetation has been really important. just on the far left there, some of the examples of some of the soil surfaces that we've come across on new properties that we've taken on. That one we actually took on in 2020, where the soils had been industrially farmed for 100 years or so, and the whole soil structure been broken down to the point where they're needing to use deep ripping as a tool to try and get some air back in there and try and get some friability. And you can see how seriously capped that soil was. And the unfortunate thing, I attended one of the industrial farming, I guess, field days a couple of years ago, and the farmers were most concerned because they were having to redo their deep ripping, after 3 or 4 years. It had got back harder and more compacted than what it had started in the beginning. So, yeah, really challenging times in that regard. But what we're finding now is a lot of the saprophytic fungi and so forth helping with that soil surface, breaking down that capping so that the water can infiltrate. So you can see quite clearly the fungal activity at the surface of that little clod of soil, and getting a lot of water infiltration. So the picture on the right-hand side there is we managed to dig down with a shovel to about 800 millimetres after, was it a 40 mil rain event? Something like that.
35, 40 mil, yeah.
Yeah, and the moisture was as far as our shovel could go without snapping it. But that was on one of those nodule soil types that we showed in the first instance, where we're getting the plant roots down into that compaction zone, and to see the water infiltrating to that level. Water is a key factor in Western Australia, as Ian mentioned. It was 2023, we had 84 mil for the growing season. So you've got to get that down deep if you want to have any chance of a crop to grow. So I guess just as looking at it as a whole and how natural intelligence farming came together, when we stepped back and looked at everything that was going on within our ecosystem, it really was, we just saw that interaction between all the microbes and then the plants and the animals, and how through the biodiversity of the microbiome within all those organisms, how they actually could spiral together, co-evolve, and just everything improve. The health of all those organisms improving, crop health, animal health, and diversity throughout the landscape. So noticing different native plants returning. And I guess ultimately, if you transfer all that into the humans that can be part of that, with consuming foods from these kind of ecosystems, then having improved human health for the people that eat that food, and ultimately their genetic expression as well, and then contributing even further to improved environmental health with reduced toxin loads and so forth. So, yeah, pretty exciting opportunities and to be able to sit and watch that. We've been very privileged to have that opportunity. And that's what drives you, I guess, to get up at 1 o'clock in the morning to talk to other people about this kind of stuff, because it's, pretty fascinating. So I can't remember, it was about 2014 or 15, I think we started calling it natural intelligence farming, because at the end of the day, we realised clearly that we weren't actually the steerers of this ship. We were just on board with the rest of the crew, the plants and the animals and the microbes out there. And certainly there was a lot more knowledge and wisdom out there within that system than we would ever have. So just to be able to trust that and, love and respect that has been a game changer for us as people and all our team that work here. And that's sort of how we look at it, just a story of love, respect and gratitude, because these things are going on and they're way more miraculous than we would ever thought possible. And who needs artificial intelligence when you've got natural intelligence?
And I think if you take what we really see, and it comes to fore, like no matter how many years you do it, and in greater scale, that you take your foot off the throat of Mother Nature, and just the remarkable things that happens. It never ceases to amaze us, whether it be dry starts, wet periods, or whatever's going on, and the ability for nature to correct and go forward is just absolutely amazing. So that's the wonder of it, is being able to sit back and watch this all happen, and you'll see just amazing things happen.
Just Dan, if we are waffling on too long, because we're not looking at how long we're speaking for, please feel free to give us a bit of a boost or something.
It's completely epic, everything you're presenting. Technically, we have 15 minutes left of your presentation time.
So-
And
All
I'd love
right.
you to get to the deeper bits and also what you're doing with the culture and the bread and things. But this
All
is
right.
really brilliant. Yes.
All right, whether we just talk faster or something. I don't know how many
Oh
pictures
no,
we've got.
it's okay if you want to. No rush. I think it's
All
it's
good.
it's really profound everything you're sharing. It's really, really, yeah, beautiful.
This picture we've included because I was listening on the radio one day of one of our Indigenous elders speaking, and he said, in their First Nations culture, they've really worked with three brains. So their cognitive brain, which is the one that they least rely on, their heart, of course, and then their gut and their gut instinct, I guess is what you'd call it, and that's the one that they relied upon the most. And I think that's what's developed for us as well over that time. And I think Jane Slattery was a real key in trying to help us to understand that in the early parts, that working with your gut instinct or your intuition actually often ended up leading you down a better pathway than what you thought you knew. And so it's been a really interesting process in trying to decouple the brain being as in the cognitive brain in your head being the one that drives you mostly, and looking at the other parts being key there.
Gut instinct and intuition is probably a key part of our decision making in this operation. Being a large operation, it takes a fair bit of getting around. It takes 2 days to drive around this farm. So you need to be in the right places at the right time, and working on that instinctive gut intuition is the key to linking in. And because we use a lot of large modern day machinery, it's we've got all the toys, so we're talking to all the satellites, steering to 2 centimeters. You can be in these big tractor cabs, and you can lose touch with the natural system because you've got so much technology and artificial intelligence coming into you from the satellites and what's beaming back to you. And but be able to actually step away from that while you're doing that and have that gut instinct and intuition come in to actually say, well, this is not actually going right in this field. It's not the right operation. It's the wrong speed. It's the wrong operation for that field at that time, and being able to pull out from it. So it's a key part of counteracting today's technology with the natural systems.
I guess you're talking about just sensing your environment all the time rather than just being driven by what the machinery can do, that you still have that sense yourself of what needs to be done or can be done better. And one of our favourite books has been Braiding Sweetgrass, which a lot of you are probably fairly familiar with, which does talk a lot of it about the intuitive side of things. I was trying to think about there's another example there on that intuitive side. Anyway, it'll probably come back. Just some of the other examples, I guess, of what's happened over time, just with the resilience of the landscape to tolerate low rainfall and so forth. Some pictures there of some of the different plants coming up, the native plants, as Ian was talking before about the plants coming up within the furrow. The mulla that I spoke about, a native herb that is actually got a very, very long tap root on it, can actually drill down into some of the compacted soils and bring nutrients back to the surface, and use a wonderful feed for the animals, but also great cover for the soil.
That's a native plant that's just come back by itself. Tremendous feed source. Would really rival tillage radish in breaking up hard pans. Absolute tremendous plant. When that's growing across a field, all you can do is smell honey, and the amount of bees and insects that attracts is just incredible. So, the natural systems, what they can bring back for free without actually having to, buy inexpensive seed sources is incredible.
Yeah, the native blue banded bee loves the the Mulla. Just a bit of an example of some of the land we took on in 2015, what it looked like the first year we went there. Very barren, low vegetation, pretty sad looking soils, and just some of the diversity a few years later. Once we changed how it was being dealt with, once again in 2020, that property I've mentioned before, some of the signs of the salinity, a lot of deep drains being put on that property to try and take away the saline water so that they could continue to grow crops there. But for us, it just seems a crazy way of going about things, because why would you want to remove water from your landscape? It's a pretty integral part of being there. And yeah, fortunately now those drains, because we're able to retain the water in the landscape where it's meant to be, don't get much water in them at all anymore. And just that same property again, that was actually in the first year we managed to get the crops growing like that, and the multi-species cover crops that we crimped, and yeah, just seeing some of the changes.
And that was an extremely dry year. You know, we had to wait till late June to actually sow that multi-species cover crop into there. Yeah, so we can get something established, because it was just a really late break to the year, dry year. And you can see that same tree in that middle photo, you know, just how it can actually, we can turn around in a period of a number of months and get things up and going.
Yeah, so that's the same tree the year before. Just some of the examples of some of the native grasses coming back. Just some of the mentions of Walter. $84 mil growing season, which we mentioned, just looking at the plant health and vigour. And what was really interesting too is see the level of cover from the plant residue there, the summer plant residues in June, and then in August, only a couple of months later, with only 70 mil growing season rainfall at that point in time, just the decomposition. So I think with the fungal activity happening.
The key to look at it, that we've had such a low rainfall, you know, 84 mil isn't a lot, you know, that's really pushing the boundaries. But we grew a crop, you know, to actually cover costs. It's not going to be a huge profitable year on that amount of rainfall. You know, give us 150 mil and, you know, we can do extremely well. But at 84 mil, it still wasn't a go behind year. But the really key thing about that, when you look at it compared to an industrial system, it was dry for everyone that year. But in our system, our ecological bank account went forward massively yet again, where if you're actually using all your synthetics and your insecticides and fungicides, you just drove your ecological bank account backwards. So you've had a double loss, or a loss on that side of it, where we had a great gain on our ecological side. So then the next year comes around and might give you a 200 mil rainfall season, bang, you're up and running, you're going forward. So you pick back right up again quickly.
And then when the rain does come down, growing some pretty magnificent crops, even though still 136 mil of rainfall at that time, hadn't been a heck of a lot. Okay, so just when it looks to restoring the communities, I guess that's where things are at for us here, trying to create an opportunity for others to come in with whatever skill sets they've got or their own passions too. Beck there in the bee suit came to us as a school teacher, has been with us for over 6 years now, and she's, you know, been, you know, wise enough to get some beehives out there to capitalise on the wonderful diversity with a lot of the wildflowers and so forth there, to create her own opportunities. But she also is a key livestock operator with myself. It's her daughter Rachel, who's been one of our key tractor drivers for many years. Tanya, who does all the compost extracting, she spends about 5 or 6 months of the year doing compost extracting for us. The granddaughter driving the header, she's now 5 years old, so she's a little bit more able than that at the minute. And one of the real joys have been of recent, we've got some wonderful friends, First Nations people who have been very generous in sharing of their wisdom and their connectedness to this country. learning a lot about, you know, some of the song lines throughout this property, and, you know, just how to really be in touch with what the landscape offers and being, you know, custodians of this landscape as opposed to the drivers of it. Have had some amazing outcomes, I guess, from a food perspective. The grain's probably been a real key one for us because we were very fortunate to develop a relationship with a miller and baker in 2019. That's actually the name of his business, Miller and Baker, but he has his own stone mill and gets the wheat from us and actually mills it in his bakery there and prepares the foods for the public. But so to actually get to your product from the paddock to the consumer and be able to get that direct feedback has been quite phenomenal and a wonderful thing for us to observe and be part of. Because the customer feedback, you know, primarily, I guess the first thing is always flavour. That's what people buy food ultimately, other than to, you know, not feel hungry anymore, but for the flavour of that food is what will keep people coming back to the door. But we've also had people that have had gluten intolerance be able to eat the bread made from our flour. So that's really interesting to see that obviously it has a very low inflammatory impact on the consumers. And yes, certainly the flavour has been winning out. That's when Mark first started off as Miller and Baker in Perth, and we now supply a couple of other bakeries as well who are having, you know, real joy in being able to, you know, create a diverse range of foods for different people, and getting a similar response from the customer feedback. We've had the grains tested at a number of different laboratories and seen that's, yeah, been pretty good on lack of toxin scale. Looking at even further value adding, do you want to talk about the beer then, Dianne?
Yeah, no, the beer's been a really success. So we've got beer on tap down in the city at the moment, and that's been amazing. We've been able to get it's barley malted and brewed, and you know the brewers are saying it's just performed just tremendously. But we've been able to just take the barley and use a small amount of organic hops. We haven't had to juice it up with other bits and pieces at all. So it's just the barley malt and just a small amount of hops and water. And the result of the beer that came out of that's just been mind blowing. It's as Di said, taste is everything, and especially for beer drinkers. And you know, taste is your first indication of a really true nutrient dense, you know, healthy food. And you know, strong believers that this food out in the marketplace will just sell itself, and it does, because if you get people to actually taste it once, they always want to keep coming back. And we've been able to prove that through the bakery outlets, and now with the beer, it's been a tremendous success.
And I guess being, you know, towards the end, some of the final slides is just that idea of being able to give back to our environment and the community, the opportunity for people to come out and share. Whenever people come onto the property, they feel it instantly. It lifts their whole demeanour. We had a farm tour during September and it was targeted towards the medical research and medical practitioner audience that haven't necessarily had any direct connections with farming landscapes and so forth. And we'd had a celebratory event at Government House the evening before to give them a bit of a taster, I suppose, of what was to be expected, and actually to launch an Alliance for Human and Planetary Health that we're setting up in Perth at the moment. But those people then got on a coach and drove for 3 hours out from the city out to the farm. You know, so they had to leave very early in the morning. Some of them missed it out on their morning coffee, and you could see as they're coming out from Perth, some looking a bit grumpy about all this because we didn't have a chance to actually stop and have coffee because it would have just taken too long. So it was very quick toilet breaks. But on the second toilet break, which was only 1 hour out from the farm, Wild Bakery provided people with a rye croissant that had been baked from the rye grown on our farm, and it was absolutely a magnificent experience, the flavour in that croissant. And you could see after that, once people got back on the bus, their energy level was, you could actually feel the buzz, the conversation levels were raised, and they got out to the farm and it just went off from there, because they got into a paddock of, at first stop was a paddock of wheat where Ian was sort of talking about what was going on there, and asked everyone to have a bit of a sample, be their own refractometer by tasting the juice in the plant stem. So they all pulled their heads of wheat out and had a chew on it, and all commented on just how sweet the flavour, within that juice in the plant was. And by the end of the day, everyone just had these massive smiles on their faces and was just so animated and very grateful for the opportunity to be out there. And we fed them with food from the bakeries throughout the day, and a good lamb soup in the shearing shed, just to make sure that they're fully well nourished by microbially and nutritionally supported foods. So just a bit of a Nana's brag photos, I suppose, just some of the diversity of some of the fungal bodies around the farm. Beck, fortunately, has got a real whiz bang with her phone to be able to take lots of shots, and I've been able to get a lot of those as well. We get a lot of joy in seeing the different things around the property and get some really nice shots, looking at the different life, whether it be reptiles or birds or insects. Huge range of diversity, different plants, flowering shrubs. Western Australia is very well known for the wonderful wildflowers we have out here. Each wildflower has its own native bee that interacts with that plant specifically. And then right down to under the microscope, which is where it all starts. Anyway, I think we might have nailed it within the time frame.
So too.
How's that, Dan?
That was completely brilliant. That was completely brilliant.
I can't believe we nailed it in that time frame.
I 90 slides and yeah, no preparation. Obviously very prepared. Do you mind stopping the screen share and we can engage
Yeah.
some Q&A and some conversation? Be in Q&A for 30 minutes or something, but or we can just see how the
There we
conversation.
go.
What's that? See how we go?
Yeah.
All right, brilliant.
I think we're awake now.
Yeah. That's okay. Such brilliant work. There's so many practical questions, so many deep questions. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 here. So maybe like a couple minutes, I'll bring up a topic and just sort of see what some of the things are, and we'll see where we go from there. Then we can, yes, anybody in the attendance, feel free to pop anything you want into the Q&A for engagement in the last bit. 3 sources of soil water. I think you referred to the sheep not needing to drink much, and which microbes are they that take hydrogen and oxygen and make water, and those are endemic to these soils, and they can be made and replicated. And I mean, that's a massive one. Do you want to just touch on that, because I think most people didn't hear what you said. It's worth elaborating on.
Okay, well, I'm trying to remember what I said, but anyway, we started noticing that there was because got water points and there might be plants around them and so forth, and be no traffic to the water points from April through to towards the end of October. So the animals have only just started drinking in the last week or so now. But the specific example over that summertime, when they weren't drinking anywhere near with the temperatures and so forth. Walter just described that because of that diversity in their microbiome that they've built over generations, and that's the beautiful thing with sheep, because they can, start to reproduce, and you can have that new generation expression coming through every 12 to 18 months, that they were able to metabolise their own water within their gut to a large extent, so not have the need, spend more time sleeping, of course, and then reducing their need. But then when you've got every mouthful that they take powerfully nutritious for them, they have less need too to be wandering the landscape, using up their water resources or energy resources. So it all works in combination beautifully once that microbiome is, really flourishing within their gut.
I think what I wanted to focus on was the term you said, metabolize their own water. And what I understand is there are microbes that, are also living in the soil, which is probably part of how you're getting those amazing rhizosheets with no rain, is that there are microbes who can take hydrogen and oxygen. And one of the things you got a lot of in low pH soil is extra hydrogen. And they can take it and they can make water. And so
that's right.
That's a real big thing.
That's something that Walter does talk about, yes, and certainly that other water source through that mechanism within the soils as well. Absolutely.
Yeah. Any comment on that, Ian? No.
Yeah, no, that's dead right. Another thing we've really noticed too, we had another example where we were harvesting. This was only a few years back, and we're harvesting down in a valley. And this particular farm, there was about 7,000 acres of wheat there. We just pulled in to start harvesting, and all of a sudden, this is about 9 o'clock at night. Just lightning strikes everywhere, thunderstorms coming through. So around the district, within a 50k radius, I think, there was about 30 fires that started all at once. So the resources of the district were spread pretty thin. But we had a big fire on our boundary, and so by the time we got activated and got up to there on our boundary, this fire was in heavy bushland, and our valley of wheat was just all down below it. We couldn't get in there. The bushland was so thick and heavy, so we were just waiting on the boundary. And by that time of the night, a lot of people had got there, a lot of fire units had got there, and we're sitting there. It was pitch black dark, and the ember shower was coming down onto our wheat crop, and it was just flying down onto the wheat crop, and you could see the embers landing on the top of the canopy of the crop and just burning on top of the canopy and then falling down in amongst the crop. And we sat there for hours watching this, and not once did that crop ignite and catch on fire. And everyone was just around there saying, I don't know what you guys know, but we don't know, but something's going on here. And I was sitting there in absolute amazement myself, and I had to go back and talk to Walter over the next number of days and understand about cell wall structure and what we're talking about, having moisture and water, and actually how these things can do, which those, even though they were a dry wheat plant that was ready to be harvested, there was still enough moisture in those cells to actually withstand that crop just igniting. So if that would have been a nitrate driven crop, it would have been a dehydrated crop. All those cells would have dehydrated, and at the sniff of one ember, it just would have gone up in a puff of smoke, and we would have lost 7,000 acres of wheat. But absolutely amazing, some of the things that you see.
Yeah, I think there's a really important piece here for desertification, reversing desertification, and functionally what the microbes can do and sources of where that water comes from. I think the graphics you shared were completely stunning. These farms that are absolute, looks like desert to me, and that growing season they're lush, and all you're doing is you're putting in that microbial stimulant. I mean, what can you talk about what the ingredients are? I mean, it's really powerful. I mean, I don't think you went into how you make the teas, but can you just like a couple minutes of what that mix is and what are the things that you do in that one pass to take what looks like desert and have it look like amazingness?
We have the bulk of the heavy lifting gets done by, well, firstly the sheep, but then there's the compost. We purchase a aerobic compost from a local guy that puts it together for us.
So I think the key to start off with there is you've got to bring as much diversity in as you can. So it's all about diversity, and we've heard around the globe, you hear all these companies and you talk about a bug in a jug. Well, it's not just one bug, you want hundreds of billions of bugs. So as much diversity as we can. So even in our compost forms that we actually go to make the compost extracts, we use a lot of different diversity in that. So, as Di said, we purchase an aerobic compost, but we make sure, and we go and purchase it off a local manufacturer, a local guy. So we try to do that a fair bit because it keeps business in the community. And if someone's doing a good job, we like to encourage them to actually do it. So we ask for specific things that it's, extractor quality stuff, hasn't got sand in it and things like that. So with that, so I can continue on with that diversity.
We do some of our own Johnson Sue compost as well. We have started our own worm farm to get some of our own worm castings, but we haven't been able to utilise that much. But we still get some worm liquid from Nutrisoil in Australia to give that component. So yeah, I guess they're the three things that we mix together to go down the tube.
That's it. No minerals, nothing. No other.
No, we have a little bit of fish seaweed and humic and fulvic acid, but that's only a very small component, just like a ignition point for the microbes. So they've got a bit of food stuff out there because some of these soils, as you saw, don't have a lot to start with.
Probably the key to it is, why we're using compost extracts is, and we're just using our compost base and putting nothing else in with it. We can actually store those liquids. So you can store those liquids for a number of months. So, but you must keep it clean with no food source in there at all. So as you know, with teas, you've got to utilise them straight away. We'll make, up to 3 million litres of compost extract a year, which is really easy to do once you get your systems in place. And then at the point of application, that's where we add our food sources. So, we'll make up a food base, and that can vary a bit each year. So, you can say particularly what's in there.
Ingredients of fish, seaweed, and humic and fulvic.
Yep, fish, seaweed, humics and fulvics, and we just vary bits throughout it. Each year it doesn't really matter. You can get a bit creative with that with your food source, but that's generally how we go about it.
Yeah, and what's the cost per hectare of this material?
Probably the dearest bit is the food source. What you're going to pay for your bit of fish and seaweed and kelps and fulvics. The compost extracts aren't, they're cents per litre. So you'd probably in one application, if you're putting down 50 litres to the hectare, actually haven't really done the figures for a long time because it's not a lot in the scheme of the farm, but probably a few dollars per hectare.
5 AUD, maybe 10.
Yeah. About that, yeah.
Yep, 5 or 10 AUD per hectare.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's your complete fertility program.
Yeah.
So I wrote down Jane Slattery, who I think is the one that I met at your event there in Perth. Was she sitting?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So you've touched on the topics of intuition, and sensing, and I think you said song lines, and I think I just saw I heard like and sometimes you do this and sometimes you do that. So do you want to just sort of go there for a few minutes?
Yeah, well, I guess that's it. There is that variation to whatever's been, around you from a seasonal perspective, and just responding to that and just feeling comfortable, I guess, to make the changes that you feel might work that season. And we've had many examples of that where Ian's pulled into a paddock and felt, no, this isn't right. We won't, even though the paddock had been planned to go into crop, then he'll pull out and shift the whole year somewhere else. And
well, I think
somewhere else.
The true magic to it, where things really start to quantify, is when you get in touch with that intuitive wisdom of what's actually going. You're walking in harmony with the country and with nature. In Australia, our First Nations people have been on country for 65,000 years, recorded here, and the knowledge, the scientific base and knowledge that they've learnt over those years is undescribable. But it's really interesting. We look at our modern day science, you know, here in Australia, it might be over 120 years, and it's only barely scratching the surface of what we might need to know, where there's 65,000 years of knowledge there. But we look at it, and some of it doesn't get looked at seriously enough because it's stored it's recorded in different ways. It's recorded in song and dance and ceremony and story and intuition and paintings and things like that, where it's not on a spreadsheet like our data. But to actually start to look into those systems, there's a lot of knowledge to be had there of actually how to walk in tune with your country. And then you bring that into modern day agriculture, and you can get the best of both worlds to actually get production, but still be in harmony with nature and be in the right place at the right time and make the right decisions.
We've often wondered whether, you know, just if someone would do some research on doing your exposure to diverse microbiomes through your environment, how that might link into your development of intuitive behaviours or sensing. Because I guess we are mostly microbes, all of us as organisms, and if they're going to be communicating and then directly communicating with you from the land up, yeah, how much of that sensation's coming from the microbiome within yourself and around you?
That third gut, which is that third brain, which is your gut, you know, is the huge part of it. Exactly what Di's saying. You know, one healthily grown grain of wheat can have been recorded up to having 9 billion microbes on one grain of wheat. So when we're looking at of producing food these days around the globe as a commodity, a lot of that has been lost. So that's where a lot of that microbiome into the food system and to our general public is lost, and we're losing touch with nature. But you bring that in and you eat those foods, it's really, really amazing how fast that can come back and link in with that.
And I think that example we were saying when the people came out in the farm tour and they ate the rye croissant with an intact microbiome within it, whammo, the people, they're transformed in front of your eyes. It was really quite phenomenal. And by the end of the day, once they come out to the property and breathed it in too, you think this is pretty powerful stuff.
So there's 2 or 3 tracks here to follow. One is the you know, that function and your experience with the intuition, as you call it. One is the implications of what you're doing with bread and, you know, in Perth. And I think there's a deeper conversation about how your lambs and your sheep, after a few generations of being on the land, develop their microbiome, they epigenetically modulate, and that may be part of what your point is about the, you know, indigenous peoples, is they've literally been on this land harmonizing their bodies to it for some time, and that's that level of intact, innate, you know, epigenetic evolution is what we talk about, and that's where that thing is. But and you guys are not from there, at least for not for too many generations, and I think you're actually doing that to some meaningful degree. So do you want to talk anything about those bits?
Well, that's really interesting. Actually, at the Government House event, we had a very small panel just to give a very brief sort of rundown about you know, virtually what natural intelligence farming was a bit, but also about these connections into human health and planetary health and so forth. And on the panel was Heidi Mipi, who is a Noongar woman here in Western Australia who's become a close friend of ours. And she said at the time, she said, I was the blackest white fella, or we were the blackest white fellas that she knew. And that was the most incredible compliment, because exactly what you're describing then, for us to be able to have these feelings and then be able to, you know, communicate with First Nations people, we just feel great together. It really works, but we've got so much more still to learn in that regard. But we're very privileged to think we're even partway on the journey of starting to understand some of things like you're talking about with that incredible epigenetic evolution that they've still got there, and they're very generous in being able to, you know, try and explain some of that stuff if we can only sit down and listen.
I think, you know, as farmers, is probably one of the biggest steps you can take forward, and start to put a bit of effort into actually getting in tune with. And it's a step where you're not going out there spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to think, I've got to actually do something. This is about just actually getting that knowledge and getting in tune with it. Let's face it, we're working with nature. We want these natural systems to start to get the quorum sensing up and going, start to get everything going. We're actually not coming from a level base anymore. We're coming from a below level base where we've got a lot of degraded lands and had lots of chemicals put on. So we've got a lot of turning around to do. And the biggest living workforce on this planet is, under our feet. What do they say? In a teaspoon of living soil, there's probably more organisms than people on this planet. And and we know probably 5% of it. And we're not going to stand around and wait for science to know 50% of it, because we're all going to be dead and gone. But we've got to actually start to be in tune with it. And to be in tune with it, that's nature and what our First Nations people know. And you don't have to be perfect at this, but you've got to actually start to lean towards of just be more accepting and think about these systems. And really, if you're going to communicate with those systems through your animals and your processes that you do on the farm, you've actually got to be thinking about what they're doing. Am I knocking them back? Am I doing this? And actually in tune. You've actually got to have the right intent. So you're there at the right, and that's not just for one person in the operation, it's for the whole team. And if the whole team have that right intent and are on that same wavelength, you get this big, happy, buzzing environment. And everything really starts to work. And the mental side of it, you hear a lot about depression these days. That's not there, and it starts to really work in collaboration with each other and roll.
I think you got something. You got there with intent, having the right intent. I think that's a really perfect encapsulation of the essence of that. Yeah, and if you engage with that intent, then it all shows itself, and you just it's an honor to serve. Brilliant. Thank you. Let me see. I mean, Government House, you did win this award, which is a pretty big deal. You said Alliance for Human and Planetary Health. Do you want to talk about, I mean, your notoriety, if you're famous, you've got power, you've got people with power are asking you questions and listening to you. I mean, there's a lot more going on than with humble farm couple here. That's not a wonderful thing to be, but
I guess, that was an incredible privilege to be awarded, WA Australians of the Year, and you sort of think, wow, and it did take us back for a bit because it certainly was unexpected, but the opportunity it has brought to us to meet with people that we wouldn't normally associate with, and to see, there's a huge yearning for this kind of understanding, and I think that's where the evolution of the idea of the Alliance for Human and Planetary Health stemmed from, because so many people came forward, particularly in Canberra, from that medical health side of things. The idea that prevention could, really make a huge difference to, the flood of chronic disease that's, really very clearly evident in our environment here in Australia, and also much so in America as well. And it just seems so obvious from what we've been seeing here on the property that to us what seems normal wasn't normal for the rest of the population, but we've got to try and share that story as much as possible. And some of the key parts, like you were saying, is that ability to be able to ingest those foods or whatever those ingredients from nature, or wear clothing from those natural sources and so forth, how that actually does transform you as a human being. But certainly seriously lacking in our communities at the moment. If we can try and reintegrate that and make that more possible for more people, then what can happen. People do transform. And mentioned the idea that mental health issues sort of become way less prevalent, because there's so much more of that natural uplift. You think of the serotonin release from smelling good quality soils and so forth. And yeah, there's so much science there that's starting to recognise it now, but we've got to really move on it and not wait around. We've got to keep bringing those opportunities together.
What it really did to us by being recognised that way is it actually would have been very easy just to say, oh no, I'm not going to accept that and just keep ticking along and keep farming. But it takes you out, pushes you out of your comfort zone, and I think we all have to get out of our comfort zones and just go that extra step further. And what that's done for us, as Di said, it's opened up our doors to meet a lot of people we wouldn't have necessarily met from all over the globe. And one thing that astounded me and it really rammed home to me was the medical professionals and doing wonderful things in health and curative health down at the end of the line. You know, they're getting just swamped with a tsunami, a tidal wave of ill health. And whether it be all these diseases from the cancers through to the MMDs and whatever, Parkinson's and that's going on. And they're doing massive, wonderful research to actually help bring cures in, prolong life, do things. But what they realise and what's really coming into the fore, and now is the time that the floodgate of that ill health has to be stopped way back down at this other end, the soil, for microbiome. And that's where they're saying to us it's really important that we get what we get right to make their job easier and stem that floodway. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to stop the ill health. So that's where it really rammed home to us. We actually have to get these messages out there about microbiome, nutritionally dense food, and linking the farmers and the medical professionals and the community all together. So that was the idea about bringing that alliance in together.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, and if that's not enough, on a practical note, you're trying to facilitate as many people in Perth eating your bread from your farm, which is massive, because with 23,000 hectares of wheat, I'm guessing that adds up to a few loaves of bread.
We haven't done the sums on that one yet, Dan, but it would be interesting.
I bet you could probably, most people in Perth could, have most of their bread needs met from your farm, and you're working on that.
Yeah, we are working
right?
on trying to get some more milling capacity. That's the biggest limitation at the moment. Both of the bakeries we supply have their own mills directly, and then they supply to some other bakeries. But yeah, we've really got to start looking at how we can increase the capacity of the milling side of it to have that stone mill being the front and centre. Yeah, that's something we're working on pretty hard at the moment, but yeah, got a bit ahead of us.
Getting healthy food through to the people, through to the populations.
That's the job.
That shouldn't only be available for the rich and wealthy of the population. It should be available for everyone. And if we can shorten that chain of getting the product to the people, that money is in that chain. They shouldn't have to pay a fortune for it. It's that can be done, and people can eat healthy food. And that's our goal, to work on that. But to do that, a bit like the soil, we have to work in collaboration. So we can't, the one Haggerty family here about running the farming system, talking about medical people and around the globe, but also building chains to go through the thing. We try to build, but it's about working, bringing everyone in from different fields with different expertise and work in collaboration to make these things happen.
Which you're not saying directly, but you are saying you're in the middle of doing. And so,
yes.
It's impossible to get a yes, we do this. Yes, we are doing that. Yes, we're also doing this. It's an amazing thing you're in the midst of. It's so impressive. It's really impressive. Let me just check my time here. Okay, I've used up most of my half hour. Let's do a few questions from the audience, and if they get used up, I've got a few more pieces I think are worth touching on. Jennifer Morrissey, and all attendees, please now for sure put your questions in the Q&A if you have things for Ian and Di. Jennifer, what varieties of wheat are you growing that are low inflammatory? I don't think it's varieties, but it'd be good to know what the varieties are. What types?
Definitely not varieties. You see in modern day agriculture these days, they'll just keep changing varieties because it's going to make a better loaf of bread or do something that, it's just really all a load of bunkum, really. It's actually how grain is grown. But generally for us, the older varieties, the traditional varieties, are the ones that we stick with. Something that's been around a long, long time. One variety we actually grow is called Federation, which was first grown in Australia in 1903. So it was one of the first wheats grown in Australia, known for a big root system, big tall growing biomass on top. So the older varieties we tend to grow. We do grow some modern varieties as well, but yeah, we lean towards the older ones.
The mainstay variety that we provide to the bakeries at the moment is one called Yippee, and I don't know how old that would be. Only 30 years, would it?
Oh, yeah.
30 years?
Probably a bit older than that, yeah.
But anyway, that's been very, very versatile. They've been able to make not only sourdoughs and so forth, but they've been able to make flatbreads and noodles and all sorts of things. So we don't get too caught up on variety now. We've been, by working with these skilled artisan bakers and so forth, they've been able to create all sorts. But once again, it comes down to the people there, because the people that we've been working with obviously have an incredible sense of working with these type of grains. And one of them, Miller and Baker, described it as a complete new experience for him because he'd never experienced such live grain. He said it talked to him every day, so he had to work with it differently every day because it was talking to him about what it needed and just reacting to stuff. And it taught him a heck of a lot. But the things he could actually create, and the same with Wild Bakery, the amount of diversity of product they've been able to make with the wheat, whereas in our system that we've got currently, the standardised system is, you've got to grow this variety for this purpose. That's all just bunkum, because the wheat can do it all if you just handle it appropriately.
As our system gets more broken, we get more quality control measures put in the industrial system, and then the varieties change, and you can't make noodles out of this is a noodle variety, and rah. Well, we've had the one variety, and we do grow some noodle varieties as well, but we've had the one variety called Yippee has made the most magnificent noodles that you'd absolutely die for, and then made the hard biscuit wheats, breads and things like that as well. So it's just amazing. Once you get it, it's a different product, and as the baker said, the first thing he does in the morning when he walks in there, he actually puts his hands in the wheat and just feels it, and actually starts to get a message of actually how he's going to bake or what he's going to create with that grain today. So I think by growing it right, we don't have to have big heaps of different varieties.
I think that's the flavour side too. Some of the older varieties that we've got here, they seem to, because they were bred with more natural root structures and so forth. So I think they've probably got a bit of a jump up on some of the more recent varieties as a result of that.
And even are they hard reds or soft whites, or they must come from some lineage, the ones you're growing?
Some of them are primarily, some of them are what they call a hard white primarily, but we have got some of the older varieties are either is it a soft red Federation, or then we got hard reds.
ASW, isn't it?
Yeah. And I'm presuming, if with everything else you do, that you're saving your own seed. And
Absolutely.
Big massive piece of the puzzle. You strongly recommend everybody stop into conversation. And you said you're coating the seed with something before you put it in. I think, just as a one minor note, what do you coat it with?
Basically the same. We don't put the food with it, but basically a pure worm liquid, so a worm juice from Nutrisoil, and also with some compost extract put in that as well.
Or Johnson Sue.
Johnson Sue is a very good seed dressing. Yeah.
And what are your yields per tons per hectare or tons per acre or whatever?
That can vary on the year. We get, like 2024, well, up the year that's just been, we had crops, yielding, 4 tonne per hectare. But our 10-year long-term average out here would be about 1.6, 1.7, out here, 1.5 is around that. That's over a 10-year with the dry years thrown in. But we get the right amount of rain, add the moisture, and you can have magnificent yields.
Adam has an important question. What's the name of the beer?
Ah,
Yeah, it's the brewery that's got its little creatures. And they started off calling it Harvest Ale, then it went to Frio Lager, and now it's called NIF beer, so Natural Intelligence Farming beer. That's what they had down at Bridgetown anyway.
Nif beer. Nice.
Really, really good thing about the beer, it's been really a good blind taste thing. So actually put it on tap, but actually there was nothing saying actually how that beer was grown or its
Yeah.
story, letting
Yeah.
it sell itself. And that's been what's so magnificent about it. It has just sold itself. So talking to the brewers and the people behind the bar, it's just really sold. So when they put a new beer online, generally it takes a long, long time to get an established market for people liking to taste.
Yeah.
And one keg will last weeks and weeks. So this thing started just over one bar selling 3 kegs in a blink. And yeah, so it's actually really been a good proof thing for us. It will sell itself. And then now as we put the story to it, it's going to be a great thing.
I think that's the thing we're always saying is that it's better, and therefore it works better, and it tastes better, and better economics, and better ecosystem and culture and everything else. You guys are just living manifestors of that. It's really, really brilliant.
I think you've said at times, Dan, that we're wired to respond to that, and I think Fred Provenza says the similar thing. We're wired to respond to those flavour profiles.
Yeah. Yeah. No, the wisdom is within. But you have to ask the right question, have the right attitude. I think that was also a key piece.
Absolutely.
All right. Priscilla says, how is nutrient density retained in value-added products in your case?
I think that's the key, shortening that. We're calling them supplier relationships now as opposed to slight supply chains, because we're wanting to be really involved with everyone along the way. And that's why direct to the miller and the bakery has been really important. So it's as fresh as possible and not adulterated. So using the slow process with a stone mill as opposed to a fast speed roller mill has made the difference, and we want to do the same with the meat. We are having the same with the barley by able to go direct to a maltster and then to the brewer who, having those personal relationships with, not going through a chain that you wouldn't even have a clue where it's got to. And I think that's the important part from our community perspective, is building those strong relationships with a trusted product that can be segregated and handled right the way through in its own integrity. And that's what we've been really strong on, because previously in a standard system, it'd go and get mixed up with all sorts of other stuff, and you've got no ability to maintain the integrity of that food stuff right the way through. But having these supplier relationships and doing more, having active involvement ourselves with that, and to try and get that right food stuff to the people appropriately. And as Ian mentioned, it can actually be cheaper.
Yeah, and keep it in its integrity, like the beer. I said it's just hops and water and a malt. So you're not having to put all these other bits of stuff in to get flavour or colour. The grains, mill them gently, so not through a high speed roller mill, hit with heat, sifted the crap out of it, and then getting that food to the people in its purest integrity that we can. So even if it's a loaf of bread, you've been able to mill it very gently. You haven't had to put any other additives or anything, whether it's just flour and water and the starter with it if it's a sourdough, and off it goes. That's what makes it. That's what really, really makes that.
Well, you have to, basically follow the traditional ways of making food, which in many cases involve the microbiome, making it more bioavailable, right? And that's what cheese is. That's what all preserved meats in the olden days, salami, pastrami, and all that kind of stuff, ham and bacon was like, microbes worked on them. That's part of the benefit.
That's it.
And because you sifted it like mad, if your loaf of bread's 5 mil lower than a highly processed loaf of bread because it's been they've boosted it right up so it'll rise, who cares? At the end of the day, it's about learning of actually what true food looks like and how it's presented.
And supporting the artisans who can operate and on scale like you are to facilitate that healing of the supply chain of food, which is what the physicians are asking you for, right? I mean, what they're saying is food's got to be better for people on scale, full stop, and we need
Yeah.
help, and you're doing it. It's
That's
Yeah.
it.
The cure to everything basically is on the end of your fork. Food is your medicine, and we've got to really start ramming that home. And the more we get that, the better things are going to be.
Yeah. All right. Billy asks, what further details can be shared of the foliar broadcast spray program, formula, rate and frequency, efficiency with worm extract, etc. Yeah, I think we covered that to a degree already, but
Generally, we only do one foliar a year. Sometimes we go into a paddock if we've got time and do two, but generally it's only one. Put it out there as gently as we can. So, we run at low pressure, extremely low filtration. So, we filter at, 20 to 30 mesh. So you don't over filter anything. Just taking the bigger things out. So you keep everything in its integrity, run it out at fraction over 1 bar pressure and put it out in a raindrop form rather than a mist as a spray. So when you're using those big boom sprays, we bypass all the computers and switching systems. So we just basically use the tank and the pump and run it out that way and through and alter our speed.
ultra high speed.
No, alter our speed to suit what rates we want. So we're not having to control it through the systems, which then puts it through a more filtration and more solenoids. So we're just straight out of a tank into pumping out through the boom. So you can actually form that raindrop form.
And any particular time of day or anything else, or whatever, it's land is too big, you can't just do whatever.
Don't get fussy, yeah. Ideally, if you can put it out late in the afternoon and coming into the evening, that's really great. And if you've had a little bit of rain and some moisture around, that's great, but that's not always possible. So just whenever.
Just whenever.
Get it out there.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to measure your property by kilometers, one to the side to side, top to bottom, what would it be if it was all one big block?
Yeah, we did have that number, but I've forgotten it. Sorry, Dan.
Like 5 by 10 or 10 by 10 kilometers or something like that?
Oh, no, a lot bigger than that.
Yeah, I think it's 20
I think
west, isn't it?
Yeah, when we hit our west boundary to the east boundaries, 25 or 6 kilometres, and that's just from one boundary to the other, same to the other. So yeah, and that's only part of a farm. I haven't really actually measured it.
I did once because I did a presentation over in Malaysia, and our farm was bigger than the island we were on at the time, which blew them all away. So yeah, they had a lot more population on their island than what we had on the farm, that's for sure. Other than microbes and organisms, I guess.
I was it was being out there in Perth, last month and seeing you guys in person, but also there was one farmer I was talking to, one couple, and I think they measured their property. They were doing beef, but it was 40 kilometers tall by 60 kilometers wide, and just that scale of what the landscape is like and what the culture is like out in Western Australia, I think is something that a lot of people probably have no comprehension for, but it's really interesting. Really interesting.
Some of those pastoral properties are pretty big.
Some of them are pretty big. Yeah. That wasn't one of the big ones. That was just
No, that's right. Yeah, some of the big ones are big.
All right. Let me see. Gatu says, how do you store compost extract in mind the microbial? Basically as in and keeping the microbes stable.
Yeah, we just store them in big tanks. We just got 50,000 litre tanks. So we store about 300,000 litres at any one time. And like I said, we just make sure they don't get any food source in them. So we just keep those tanks clean. So at the end of the season, they're washed out and just left with water in them. And then we start adding our extracts, when we start brewing them up in early March. So, but keep the food source out and they'll just store there in their liquid form. We don't have to stir them or anything. Yeah, they're fine.
Nice. Can you, is there anything else that you add beyond the fulvic and humic and fish and kelp? Are there other anything you add? Nothing, no herbs or
not really.
nothing, not really.
You know, if anyone wanted to, you can get creative at that stage. You know, that's where you can play around a bit if you wanted to put a bit of this, that, or that in. But our main thing is just to put a food source in to actually activate and let those microbes do those things. I think the importance of it is, if you're doing it right, you've got to be, you know, one thing we've learned, and through some of the chemical residue testings that we've done and some of the testing we have done in the United States, is that small amounts of synthetics can really turn your system around the other way, you know. So you think, oh, you know, I know a lot of people think, oh, we'll just slowly drop down. And it's a good way to just back off and add your biology and back your synthetic system right down. And that's the way a lot of people will slowly go about it. But the true magic is when you get rid of all of those. And that's when your biology really starts to go. So even what we've learned, you know, even just 1 kilo of phosphorus per hectare can turn a lot of things off. You know, you cut back, you're going to get a lot of good results. But if you take it out altogether and get your system operating properly, well, that's when the magic really starts to happen.
And I think what we have noticed too is we have farmed a lot of different farms in our time, probably over 40 different properties in the 30 or so years Ian and I've been farming together. But what has happened there's been a consistency across all soil types in how we don't even do a lot of tissue testing anymore, but when we were doing lots of tissue testing, is that the consistency there would develop in the nutrient uptake of the plants across all soil types and all different environments. And so it got to the point where if you had a slight deficiency on something 1 year, by the next year it could be something completely different or had sorted itself out. So that's why we just mainly choose the fish and the seaweed primarily, because they've got very diverse nutrients at micro levels within them anyway, rather than trying to put on, you know, big band-aids or something. We're just tickling, I guess, the whole system along the diversity of those microbes within it, so that everyone who's got a different preference within the soil, they might be able to find something that feels good or tastes good for them.
Probably another tool you can use to boost your crop in certain seasons is actually, even though your cash crops, whether it be your wheat crops and things like that, but we find we have a lot of diversity in our crops now. Even though we call it a cash crop, you actually walk through it, there is actually a lot of diversity in there. There can be dormant native grasses sitting there, and lots of things. You know, it's not just a clean paddock anymore when you look in between the runs of the disc seeder and that. But if you've got your livestock balanced correctly, you know, put a light graze through your crops. You know, that's saliva. The saliva in a well-balanced animal, you know, can really be a stimulant to a crop, you know, and, you know, you really pull that livestock out, and it's like if you put that artificial shot of nitrogen on a crop, you know, it can make a really big difference.
You're saying when the wheat is still growing,
Yes.
before it's headed up, when it's like a foot tall or
before full stem elongation, you know.
That 4-leaf stage, you know, you can actually put a light graze through it and make, it does it world good.
So brilliant. And just on the point of diversity, I think you mentioned Colin Seiss. I don't think he necessarily is someone who's known by all of our audience and what his work is. Do you mind just giving a moment to that? Or
Colin was the one that sort of put the term to pasture cropping, sowing, growing cash crops effectively into whatever native pastures there might be, and he's found them work hand in hand really nicely.
Yeah, and Cole's done a lot of brilliant work, you know, around the globe and teaching on that. So did that very successfully and has done really well at it.
Seeding cash crops into pasture, just so everybody heard that.
Primarily they're sort of like summer active again, which is, you know, fairly common in Australia, thankfully. So it does work really well with a winter dominant, you know, cash crop cycle.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things that people who know, people who don't know may never have heard. This is a really big thing. Who's that other guy in Australia who puts in like 4 or 5 species of cash crops in his plantings? I can't
I guess the one that I know best of would be Grant Sims. He does a lot of you know, like multi-species stuff over in Victoria as well. But whether that's the one you're thinking of, I'm not too sure.
Yeah, and I think another thing that you know, a bit of companion cropping, you know, we're doing a a fair bit of that these days, so you know that works really well. But also probably another thing is doing when we were talking about varieties a minute ago is actually mix your varieties up. You know, don't just grow all of one variety. You know, what we found very successful, we can have 6 or 7 different varieties of wheat, you know, all just mixed up together. So, you know, they can have different flowering times, different root lengths, and it's a really good strategy, you know, for seasonal management.
And when you're integrating multiple different crops into one planting, you want to talk about that? And my understanding is that, you know, enhances resiliency. Things generally come ripe at the same time. You can significantly augment your profit per acre based on being able to harvest multiple seeds per acre. All you need effectively is a different head on your combine. Is that that's what you're doing?
We are, yes, but we're also having to put it through a seed cleaner, a separator, effectively. So, yeah,
Right.
a lot of those ones, they are a bit trickier to separate, but that we might have to sort them out a couple of times post-harvest.
Yeah. And that
But
is
we're also, looking at selling that as a mixed, mixed grain sample anyway, because one into the human food side, you know, it would be perfect. But also for livestock feed as well. There's a lot of people that still feed grains and that to livestock, and it works best for them too.
So we got a crop out there now that's you know, just it's a wheat rye mix. You know, there's a lot of rye in amongst the wheat, and in the past we try and separate that a bit, but you know, we're eating bread at the moment. One of the bakeries played around. It's a wheat rye mix. And so we're just going to keep it as that wheat rye mix, mill it and bake it. But and it's actually this bread that's done like that is to die for. You know, it's absolutely fantastic.
It's so brilliant. Just take out the extra steps, just grind it all together, make it live every day, whatever how it wants to be. Oh, it's you're coming back to the foundations of life, right? It's like removing all these false blocks and boundaries and structures and just getting back to probably how it was done for a long time.
That's
absolutely
right.
Yeah, completely brilliant. Shauna asks, I'm curious about the level of employees or people on the farm from when they started to now, including the value added products. Seems so full of life and so rich.
Yeah, so from the value added side, well, that's huge because the bakeries have got a huge number of staff there.
Yeah.
When we first
started, just 2 of us.
Even and I to start with. What do we got now? We got.
I would probably have you know, in and out on the farm, probably 9 or 10 on property. Our big thing is we could probably run with actually a few less because the farm's so efficient, but we have people come, you know, and people just come and end up staying. And you know, our thing is actually to bring more people in and give more people opportunity. So at any one time on the farm at the moment, we probably have about 10 people, and then associated things that getting product to market and that, and then the bakeries and that, you know, it'd be too many to count. Hundreds, lots of people that come in. So it's just really bringing that community of people in.
On farm, we've got a housing deficiency. We need more houses. So we're trying to work on getting some tiny houses around the place so that more people can spend more time.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to spend our last couple of minutes, is this vision for what does, you know, human culture look like going forward. For me, occupying the land tenure, you know, practical skills, you know, is the future. And I don't know if you guys have thoughts or visions or comments you want to talk about that. I think it's a systemic need for culture is to reverse the tide to the cities, and how to accomplish that is it's a big, you know, conversation at least.
Yeah. Well, I think our first thing is, you know, probably heard Diane say that land that we look after, we're very careful to steer away from this ownership module of land, you know, and just because of the Western world, yeah, sure, someone's got to have the way the law states at the moment, someone's got to have their name on the title of the land, but wow, so what? But you know, so you've actually got to get that out of your mind and say, you know, the land is everyone's land. and it's just going to be cared for and nourished by everyone. And that changes your whole thinking about people and bringing people in and sharing the land and actually what that land can do for everyone. So, yeah, that is our aim, bring more people in. So as Di said, we need to get more accommodation out here, but that's our next goal. And people that just might want to come and stay for a day, you know, a week, a month, and just experience. People that might want to come and actually bring something into the business and have a great idea and say, gee, can I start this up here? And say, absolutely. You know, it's opening up those opportunities for everyone. Just because we need to set a system up, just because you don't inherit land means that you'll never be associated with land or be a farmer. You know, you can be in the city. There should be, one of Diane and I's personal goals to set systems up so people can have opportunities, and that gets to our financing system. And our financial system's fairly broken, you know, like we go to the bank and here in Australia we buy land and pay the joys of 7 to 8 to 9% interest for doing it. And not a lot of people can do that. So we need to set up a financial system that rewards ecological improvement, you know, building that ecology, building that food system, and the finance has to back it in different manners and not be extractive. So that's a lot of systems that we're looking at the moment, because there's a lot of money around this globe that is just sitting in bank accounts and wondering what's going to be done and how it can be put into sustainability and encouraging people. We're working hard, and part of these awards that we've got has opened a lot of doors to look at these systems.
Yeah. From a personal perspective, what we're wanting to achieve is, one, have more capacity for more people to be part of the team. We've got a number of chefs that want to come on property and cook for everybody, and we have already got some veggie patches and so forth, but ultimately be able to produce all the different food types that we're wanting to consume as a community out here on property, and skillfully prepared by someone who loves to do that. So I'm not having to cook when I come home at night time, but so we can all share meals together and things like that. And we also have a capacity there within the broadness of that whole landscape. And these are some of the conversations we're having with some of our First Nations friends, is the opportunity then for young people to come and be involved, because there's such a diversity of things, whether it's collecting seeds and growing seedlings and replanting seedlings, and as in trees and shrubs and so forth, and native medicine bush and all the rest of it. But then just that interaction at a cultural level too, and, you know, spending time together, doing stuff more as a community on country.
And I think probably one thing for us too, you know, looking at globally, you know, we've built scale here on the farm, and part of that's also been is actually to set up markets. So we know we've got that integrity in the soil. We haven't actually had to bring a whole heap of people together and make sure everything was right. So with our wool, you know, we've got great markets into Europe with that, with some of the big fashion labels, but we're able to fill our own containers with and have enough wool to do that. And then we're able to get that processed in its own right and spun in its own right. And then it could be the garment could be put on the blooming model or in the fashion parade in its own integrity, which then that is story was related back. So by having the scale, we've been able to set those markets. It's the same with the grain, you know, we could have 15, 20,000 tonne plus grain that we can then open up then while we're doing all our artisanal stuff on a local level and that. But we're all going to encourage the big business in town that buy tons and tons of product and food that are now starting to talk, we need to start switching how we buy food, but where do we get it? Well, now you can come, you know, come and knock on the door. You can come and buy 5,000 tonne if you want to, you know, and also assist with that process of actually maybe storage or how we get it to you wherever it might be on the globe. It opens up those opportunities for the big and the small.
Yeah. This has been an amazing 2 hours. You guys are just doing absolutely wonderful work. I think I hear in your sometimes understated explanation the things you're working on, but it's just a complete inspiration. And I'm sure you hear that from many people. But really absolutely grateful that you got up at the wrong time of day to come and be part of this conversation with our global audience. And I hope a lot of people here have been inspired. I'm sure they have been. And then, yeah, the recording going into the future. But thank you both so much. Really, really
Thank you
appreciate
for having us, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Absolute pleasure.